Well, immigration is easy to handle. We've got two really strong scholars with us. Shantu Yangar is Stanford. Doug Massey is Princeton. And the factoid that we want to share about Doug Massey is his grandfather was an undocumented immigrant to the United States. So that probably explains some of the passion he has for this topic. And Shantu, I have to say, and it's painful for me to say it, but he's a competitive cricket player, and I keep wanting to be a competitive baseball player, and and I failed. And I just wonder if you got any lessons for.
Well, I played before they had helmets.
Oh, I see. Good.
Yeah. Just think how far you could have gone.
Doug, shall we get started?
I got my PhD in 1975, and I published my first op-ed in the New York Times in 1978. I got my PhD in 1979. I published my first op-ed piece in the New York Times, blithely unaware that I was threatening my entire academic career by being so public at so young an age. But I've always felt a real obligation to make the results of my research public, because I've really benefited from public support over the years. I went to public schools all the way through high school and then into college. I went to Princeton for graduate school, but I was supported by an NIH training fellowship, and then I had an NSF postdoc, and in my entire career as a scholar and researcher in sociology and demography, my research has been supported consistently by the National Institutes of Health. So I really feel an obligation to make my work known to a wider public. So I've written a lot of books. These are just 4 of the books that I've written about immigration, and some of them are with academic presses, and we all know what happens to those. But whenever I write a book, I try to write it not for specialists, not for people who are interested in the technical details. I do that all in articles in the professional literature, and in the books I try to write clearly and simply for a broader audience. I also engage in a lot of media presentations. PBS, I've been on the Today Show, Kudler and Company, CNN. My most successful intervention is a program I did on a network called True TV for a program known as Adam Ruins Everything, where Adam bursts the balloons of people with false beliefs. And he did one on the border wall. And I come out from behind a cactus and explain why building a border wall really is not a very wise idea or a wise use of funds. And it has 5.3 million views at this point. I also cooperated with a PBS documentary that showed on a variety of PBS programs around the country as the talking head. And I came to understand how much film you have to shoot to get 15 minutes on screen. I've done a lot over the years. Down to the bottom left-hand side, there was a Broadway play that I helped write the liner notes for. Up at the top of the left, you see me with the cactus after I emerged from it, and various appearances in various places to try to get the word out about immigration. I've also testified before Congress 5 times in the first decade of the 21st century. There's a picture of me testifying before a Senate committee with C-SPAN. And the message I was trying to get out throughout this series of presentations was that border enforcement was not working. that border enforcement did not deter people from coming to the United States, but by raising the costs and risks of border crossing, it deterred people from crossing the border, which they eliminated by staying in the United States once they crossed. And over the period of a decade or so, it transformed what had been a circular flow of male workers going to 3 states into a settled population of families in 50 states and doubled the net rate of undocumented population growth. But they didn't listen. So now we have 11 million people out of status. To illustrate, and what this has led me to believe is that I think I've gotten actually better at communicating over time. I've got a lot of experience doing it, but in my experience, it's not the communication that has become the problem. It's the context into which you're trying to communicate, which has changed dramatically. And to illustrate what the world is like now, I want to go through my experiences with a couple of National Academy panels. To the left, you see the integration of immigrants into American society. I was a member of that panel, and that report was well received. And then the one to the right was the economic and fiscal consequences of immigration. And there I was not a member of the panel, but I was a reviewer as a member of the National Academy. I was a reviewer of that panel, and I followed it, and I read the report and followed what was going on. And so that's what I'm going to focus on. As the NASs want to do, they really did a press release when the report on economic and fiscal consequences came out. A nice report that really summarized the data in a very accessible, neutral way without taking political stands, just trying to lay out the facts, like Joe Friday on the old TV show. In the mainstream press, the New York Times, the message was received. Americans aren't taking American jobs. New study finds. Wall Street Journal, immigration does more good than harm to the economy. Study finds. Washington Post, Trump, in the middle of this, claimed that immigrants cost taxpayers many billions of dollars a year. And the Washington Post checked it against the National Academy report and gave it 3 Pinocchios, which is not quite 4, but sufficient to say that it wasn't exactly true. The problem comes when you get to the rest of the blogosphere and the internet. The Center for Immigration Studies sounds neutral, but it's an anti-immigrant group. And their headline was National Academy of Sciences Study of Immigration, Workers and Taxpayers Lose, Businesses Benefit. Now, that was not in the conclusions. Heritage Foundation, National Academy of Sciences report indicates that amnesty for unlawful immigrants would cost trillions of dollars. And these are 2 of the more respectable Beltway bandits. We get a little bit further down the food chain. The National Review, National Academy of Science reports indicates that amnesty for unlawful migrants would cost trillions of dollars. The Washington Examiner, immigration costs at least $278 billion, and they didn't even mention illegals. They only mentioned them 3 times. They used things like unauthorized or undocumented instead of illegal, which is what they wanted. And then moving further, the Daily Signal, amnesty would cost taxpayers trillions. National Academy of Sciences report indicates. Breitbart, National Academy study shows $500 billion. The numbers keep getting bigger and they get thrown around. On working Americans, and InfoWars, a report explains financial cost of illegal immigrants for American taxpayers. And the Wall could save taxpayers $64 million over the next decade. Well, the Wall cost is estimated as at 23 or 24 billion. And here you see a Breitbart headline, National Academy of Studies. And it turns out that there was a mole on the NRC panel that did the report on the economic and fiscal consequences of immigration. Harvard economist George Borjas, who broke the embargo, leaked the report to news, and so that worked with Breitbart to prepare a response. So on the day that it was released, Breitbart already had the information, already had the counter narrative going in the press, and he helpfully provided on the same day a user's guide to the 2016 NAS report on the economic and fiscal consequences of immigration. and a very tendentious summary of what goes on. And so he basically signed off on an NAS report and then did his best to undermine it as soon as it was released, which I find to border on the unethical. How did we get into such a circumstance? I'm a sociologist, so I'll give you a sociological analysis. There's been a huge structural shift in American society, driven by political decisions and also driven by technological changes. It goes back to the rise of cable news. Congress deregulates the cable industry in 1984. Prior to that, it was regulated as was broadcast television. And prior to this date, there were basically 5 sources of broadcast news: ABC, NBC, CBS, PBS, and the newcomer at that point, CNN. After the deregulation, they were joined by Fox in '86, CNBC in '89, Bloomberg 1990, FSTV 1995, MSNBC 1996, Blaze, One America, CBSN, and Newsmax all came in later years. What made this proliferation of cable channels more tendentious was the end of the fairness doctrine. Prior to 1987, the FCC required broadcasters to devote some of their airtime to discussing controversial matters of public interest and to air contrasting views regarding those matters. And the controversial issues had to be presented in a manner that was, in the Commission's view, honest, equitable, and balanced. Very quaint. Basically, the FCC said, we're going to give you access to all these different airwaves, all these different channels, in return for which you'll set aside a small amount of the time for a public good, a public service. That was repealed in 1987. And the next step in the shift was the rise of the internet and social media. Netscape comes into existence in '94, Explorer 1995, Google 1998, Facebook 2004, and Twitter in 2006. And these have this massive expansion of social media that becomes an independent source of information and a huge player in the transmission of knowledge among the public. Then, of course, we get the diffusion of internet news sites as alternatives to the mainstream press. InfoWars, Breitbart, the Daily Signal, the Daily Caller. And the advent of internet trolls, bloggers. Troll is a person who sows discord on the internet by starting arguments or upsetting people, by posting inflammatory, extraneous, or off-topic messages online in a deliberate attempt to undermine facts and knowledge and to stir up controversy and to sow disunion and disbelief and discontent. And finally, the rise of dark money. The Citizens United decision of 2010 by the Supreme Court ruled that freedom of speech prohibited the government from restricting independent political expenditures by profit or nonprofit corporations. And this has had a huge effect. So much money is being poured into the public sphere to generate misinformation and disinformation. And it has become a serious problem. I recommend Jane Mayer's book, Dark Money, and this is a quote. This is the president of Americans for Prosperity, which is a Koch brothers funded group. Who could be against prosperity? And this is what they claim, most of the candidates have figured out that science has become political. We've made great headway. The vast majority of people who are involved in the Republican nominating process and conventions in the primaries are suspect of science, and that's our influence. Groups like Americans for Prosperity have done it. So we're always told not to be political and partisan when we speak at the NAS, but unfortunately, science and support for science has become a partisan issue. This is a graph from an article that appeared in the American Sociological Review. It comes from the General Social Survey. It's Trust in Science from 1974 to 2010. And what you see is that back in 1974, this is for conservatives, liberals, and moderates. And what you see in 1974 is that liberals and moderates all believed that science was fairly truthful and trustworthy. And in fact, conservatives were slightly higher than liberals. But over the next several decades, what happened was conservatives fell fell steadily and created a huge and wide gap in trust of science, belief in science between liberals and conservatives. So unfortunately, at this point, science really has become a partisan issue because one of the major political parties in the United States has steadily backed away and turned from belief to disbelief in science. So my conclusion is that the problem increasingly is obfuscation and not communication in this society. And when you communicate and put your intelligence into the public sphere, what you have to do simultaneously is be ready for the counterintelligence that is actually going to be coming at you immediately as you release your data, and have a strategy to counter the counterintelligence using social media, using the tools of the internet, using all the modern techniques that we have. So it's not enough simply to communicate clearly and effectively. You've got to have a counterinsurgency tactic ready to go to fight the inevitable information wars. Thank you.